single person who works at Tor absolutely madly loves books.
Yay!
I don't think you've ever hired anybody who didn't like to read.
First comes the story. This is,
Yes.
yeah.
And we all love what we do. We may be absolutely infuriated sometimes. We may hate something with a burning passion sometimes, but the passion remains burning. But fundamentally, we all love our jobs and love what we do.
Yeah,
So-
I once hired an editor at Tor because, in part, during the interview, he told me about when he was a teenager, having read really a lot of fantasy, and got to the end of one fantasy series which he thought ended very badly, and he was so angry he borrowed his grandfather's Luger and went out in the backyard and shot the books.
Oh, yeah.
I said, okay, that guy cares about books.
And Tom, one of the things that Tom has always done is encourage that in his staff. Not that necessarily the action.
I do have an empty ammunition case on my bulletin board that was given to me by a former managing editor.
Yes. But, you know, Tom has always said he hires people who love what they do. And he lets people buy books if they clearly, passionately love the book. I mean, the best way to sell Tom on an acquisition is to just absolutely adore the book and go in and make it clear to him how much you love this book.
Yeah, it's true. There have been,
But it has to be genuine,
I think
and you can't fake it.
most longtime editors at Tor have had the experience of, you know, that book that is simply so good, even though it presents certain commercial difficulties, that you just have to publish it. And,
Yeah.
and has had the experience of going into Tom basically saying, this is just a mandatory book. We just have to do this.
Yeah.
You know, and, all well-run publishing companies do a certain amount of that kind of almost pro bono publishing.
Yes.
You know, you can't let it take over because you have to pay the bills. But you know, and sometimes those books do better than you think they're gonna. Something you were almost touching on, though,
Yeah.
that I wanted to clarify is that, you know, as I think you were getting from what we were saying, you know, overseeing the acquisition, overseeing the assessing the slush pile is really, in time terms, although it's a time sink, is a really minor part of what we do. It's a really minor part of what we ought to be doing.
Right.
You know, our primary commitment is to the books we own, the books that we have, that we've taken on an obligation to publish, and
Right.
you know, and doing a good job of publishing those books is always going to be first in line, which is why it sometimes takes months to get to the unsolicited
Right.
submissions.
Or even the solicited
Or
submissions.
even the solicited submission.
You know, because, my first responsibility is to the books that I'm actually publishing.
Yeah.
Which is to say, I don't feel guilty when something is
Well, yeah.
sitting around my office long enough to grow moss.
Yeah. But it happens. All right, you and then you.
Okay, I have two questions. First, would I be correct in saying that you're willing to publish someone who a book, regardless of whether the author's new or established?
No, because realistically speaking, an established writer with an established, strong sales record is preferable to an author that has no sales record. But usually we don't have to make that decision. On the other hand, you know, a first novel is an unknown quantity and could be extremely successful, whereas a second or third novel by a writer who has not sold very well is a known problem.
The hardest
And we'll buy the first novel over that.
The hardest thing in the world is the third novel.
Yeah.
By somebody whose first two novels have
Have
not
not sold
done
well.
fantastically well. But you know, one is rarely presented with, you know, you can buy this book or that book.
Right.
You know,
That just
work
doesn't
way.
happen. It doesn't happen.
Books are assessed on the their merits as books, and also on can we sell this. I have turned down really good books that I thought Tor would do a particularly terrible job of publishing, because every house has its strengths and weaknesses. Every house has its kind of books that you can put together a coalition of people who will be really enthusiastic. And you know, there are a few books in the world that I'm going to love to pieces, but I'm going to be one of the two people at Tor who will even understand why they're any good. And I'm just not going to buy them for Tor. They can find another publisher that's more
Right.
suited to them.
Let me give you a perfect example of this. I had a book from a very well-known science fiction writer who had a relatively successful career, but not a best-selling career. However, this was, you know, a hard-hitting, no punches pulled mainstream novel. Okay? And I thought about it. It was a pretty good book, but it was not the best mainstream novel I had read that year. And I said, okay, look, here's the problem. I could buy this theoretically and publish it through Tor. If I published it through Tor, Tor being a company that is known for science fiction, and you being a writer who is known as a science fiction writer, this book would end up in the science fiction section of stores a lot of places. It would be very hard for us to prevent that, and in the end, it would be impossible to prevent it 100%. And it wouldn't sell there, and it wouldn't satisfy the audience there. So we would be, you know, risking mispublishing you if we bought your mainstream novel, even if we put a like novel on it instead of science fiction or mainstream cover and all that, because there's so much identification out there in the marketplace with Tor as a science fiction publisher. And so, you know, and I discussed it with Tom. We decided to regretfully and politely turn the book down.
Right.